There are no orders tonight, no objectives, no timelines. Just a calm military sci-fi narrative told slowly, meant to keep your mind at ease as you fall asleep. I remember the moon as a flat, white burn on the dark. From orbit, it looked sterile, a dead disk of salt glass with a few iron thorns poking through the crust. Someone in Fleet Ops had decided that made it ideal as a depot spine. Nothing grows, nothing moves, nothing to complicate things. Just set down magazines, dig bunkers, tuck ships in the shadow of old industrial skeletons, and keep pushing the front outward. We were the proof of that assumption, dropped in to confirm the emptiness. The drop barge shook its way down through static and debris cloud. There was no atmosphere to bite against, just a series of braking burns and stubby thrusters fighting inertial memory. I watched the impact-scored hull of the docking ring rise to meet us through the forward blister. The ring's outer surface was a mosaic of repairs and fractures, overlapping patches where micrometeors and thermal stress had chewed at it for decades. Routine, the brief had said. Low-risk survey. Salt Moon designated as abandoned industrial site. No confirmed active hostiles. Minimal residual radiation. Establish atmospherics. Verify structural loads. Scan for any unexpected signatures. Green light or red light. That was all. Inside the barge, 12 exosuits stood latched to the floor like an additional row of machinery. My suit was number 7. Pale ceramic composite dulled by earlier campaigns. The HUD floated a vertical stack of vitals and task tags in front of my left eye. My name in corner text, my squad's telemetry in a strip below it, all green. The barge locked to the docking ring with a metallic jolt that ran through the hull and my bones. I felt the change in gravity as the ring's slow spin became our new down. Pressure equalized. A strip of icons flashed from red to yellow to green in the corner of my display. The inner hatch cycled open on a cloud of dust so fine it moved like smoke. The docking corridor beyond had not been designed for ceremony. Raw structural ribs, exposed conduits, panels that had been removed and never replaced. The air our suits sampled from the corridor was thin, stale, and laced with abrasive particulate. The system tagged it as safe enough to crack helmets in an emergency, not that anyone had any intention of doing that. They were waiting for us beyond the decontamination frame. Thin people in patched pressure garments, faces veiled by clear visors so scratched they turned eyes into smears. Their suits were a generation behind ours in design, layers of insulation and tape over old tiers. Each one wore the same gray band on the upper arm, more for mutual recognition than any allegiance that meant anything to Fleet. They bowed slightly as we stepped through the frame, a small synchronized motion. It was the first indication that they operated according to patterns and not just necessity. I logged them as local maintenance cast. That was the phrase in the brief. Humans left behind when the original corporation pulled out decades earlier, or their descendants. The packet claimed they'd been contacted, that they had accepted servicing contracts to keep the old refineries in a mothballed state in exchange for supplies and occasional medical. Watching them stand there under the harsh strip lamps, I could believe the part about being left behind. Their shoulders had the permanent inward curl of people who had never been comfortable under full gravity. Skin the color of old parchment where the suits let it show. Movements economical, no wasted muscle, no wasted breath. One of them stepped forward, taller than the rest, an old patch of command strip on their chest unit. They made a gesture toward the corridor beyond, then another indicating the spinning concept of the ring. I recognized the basic sign language from the orientation slab. Welcome, follow, gravity down. We did. The platoon moved out in box formation, exosuits whispering and clicking with every step. I had second squad. Our drones unfolded from their docking racks and skimmed ahead, insect silent, their sensor cones painting the corridors in invisible fields. The ring's interior layout was a loop of decks, maintenance shafts, and access to the old lift spines. Every 30 meters, a viewport looked out on the white plains and the distant shapes of refineries and conveyor lines. From inside, the moon looked less like a dead rock and more like a cauterized wound. The salt glass was not smooth, it broke into ridges and waves where thermal events had once fused and floated. The locals moved with practiced ease. They knew every ladder, every low bulkhead, every broken segment of mesh. They showed us routes, pointed to indicator panels still functional, shook their heads at others. Their silence was not timid, it was ritual. Our brief said nothing about them being a problem. No recorded incidents, no affiliations, just residual labor in a forgotten system. I logged each observation anyway. The first anomaly that stayed in my head was the cleanliness. In abandoned places, dust settles in layers, takes on the patterns of drafts. Here, some corridors were as you'd expect, a thin skin of powder on every horizontal surface, ghosted footprints tracing the locals' regular paths. But in certain zones, near specific shaft heads, around heavy transfer doors, the floors were swept to raw metal. No loose particulate, no debris, even between grating teeth. Locals avoided stepping there, as if reluctant to mar an invisible boundary. We walked past a triple-sealed hatch where my suit registered thermal bleed, a faint warmth, too regular to be decay. The local team lead gestured us onward, hand flat, fingers splayed, a sign I did not find on the orientation charts. Not for you, not now, not necessary. The platoon leader noted it, shrugged inside his armor, and continued. The schedule was tight. Fleet did not slow for the discomfort of survey teams. We established our first staging point in a radial hub where 3 lift spines met like long, dark wells. From there, squads were assigned sectors, refineries to the north and south, conveyor lines, and slide fields to the east. My squad drew the northern refinery arc structures designated N3 through N9 on the old corporation schematics. We rode the lift down in a cage that creaked and swayed in low gravity. The shaft wall slid past in a blur of cables and maintenance rungs. Below, the faint glow of emergency strips pulsed in a steady rhythm like a slow heartbeat. When the doors opened, the air changed. It smelled of old lubrication and cold metal, a sharp contrast to the dust-tainted ring. The refinery interior was vast, towers of equipment, pipe forests, catwalks stretching off into the dim, everything lit by those same pulsing strips. My suit overlaid a grid on the world, marking structural members, potential fall risks, radiation pockets. The locals did not follow us here. That was the second anomaly. At the threshold, they had made a gesture again, palms together, then apart, an old industrial safety sign meaning danger or restricted. Officially, the corporation had signed the refineries over as derelict assets. Unofficially, the maintenance caste still treated them like sanctums. We advanced without them. Drones fanned out ahead and above. Rail carbines tracked intersections and open gantries. I could feel the old heaviness in my leg with every careful step onto a catwalk that bounced slightly under my weight. Industrial emptiness has its own kind of silence, not the quiet of natural places, but the quiet of systems spun down, pumps and conveyors no longer cycling. Here, though, the silence was incomplete. Beneath it, my suit's vibrosensors picked up ongoing movement, distant hums. Unseen mechanisms still turning in the deep. I logged that too. For 2 shifts, we did what we were trained to do. We scanned structural supports, ran integrity checks on walkway beams, mapped radiation spikes from old reactor leaks. We tagged potential magazine spaces and hangar volumes. We watched the locals in the ring and on the surface move along their habitual routes, always skirting certain zones, always returning to their pressure warrens at the same intervals. Each shift, we sent compressed data bursts up the relay chain. Each time, Fleet's answer came back in tight band pings, continue survey, maintain schedule. The main task force burned inward on its plotted trajectory, a mass too large to adjust on a whim. On the third shift, my first drone vanished. We were exploring a section of N5, a high bay where old conveyors hung from the ceiling like dormant arteries. I sent the drone through a narrow gantry to map thermal signatures at the far end. Its telemetry looked clean for 50 meters. At 51, every channel went black. No fragmentation pattern, no spike in EM, no hint of a physical impact. One moment I had a full sensor suite streaming. The next, I had nothing. I marked the location and pulled the second drone back to line of sight. The squad tightened formation. Rail carbines rose an incremental degree. No one said anything. They did not need to. Years of drill had trained us to read each other through posture and weapon angle, more than words. We advanced to the point of loss and found nothing. No debris, no scuffed dust on the metal grating. Just a corner where two bulkheads met and a vertical access shaft led down into unlit space. My suit registered faint EM noise crawling up from below, just above the baseline hum of the refinery. I flagged the shaft as a no-go zone. The platoon leader acknowledged the notation. He had his own list of similar anomalies from other sectors by then. Doors that locked themselves, conveyor belts that shifted position overnight, status panels that went from dead to active to dead again with no maintenance record. Still, none of it crossed the threshold from eerie infrastructure to confirmed hostile. The threshold finally arrived in the comms window on Shift 5. Fleet's brief had embedded our primary transmission opportunity in the moon's rotation, a 15-minute alignment when the ring's main uplink hub could see the fleet's relay spine without interference from the moon's own bulk and residual fields. We were to gather, collate, and send a full survey summary then. The green light or red light would ride that beam. The hub was a wide circular chamber set in the ring's upper levels. A line-of-sight mast protruded from its roof like an antenna tooth, pointing at the star-deep dark. Banks of control consoles, many dead, lined the chamber's outer wall. In the center stood the primary uplink pillar, an armored cylinder with a recessed maintenance strip running up its side. The locals had cleaned the floor here to a metallic sheen. We arrived 10 minutes before the window, squads filing in from different spokes of the ring. Suit identifiers painted the room with color-coded outlines. My squad took up a defensive arc along the inner railing, overlooking a short drop into a lower equipment pit. Drones nested along the upper walkway rails. The locals were present, but they kept to the periphery. They watched us with that same flat, inward-curled posture, hands folded, expressions hidden behind scratched visors. Their helmets were older than some of the rifles in our racks. The platoon leader initiated the uplink sequence. Systems booted in a cascade, status lights running up the pillar. My HUD briefed a timer in the upper corner, counting down to alignment. Then the room changed. There was no warning shot, no shouted word, just the sudden clack of multiple bulkhead locks engaging at once. The four main doors to the hub slammed shut, pressure seals biting, their indicators flipping to deep red. Atmosphere began to vent, but not through a catastrophic rupture. It bled out in controlled streams through ports in the ceiling, the way a system would equalize before a burn. My suit sealed to full internal life support in less than a second. The HUD shifted color scheme. External audio cut down to essential ranges. Inside that sudden muffled quiet, I watched the locals. They did not panic. They stepped backward as one, away from the center of the chamber, toward maintenance recesses I had barely registered. Some moved to panels and keyed sequences with practiced hands. Others simply disappeared through floor hatches that slid aside to let them pass. The uplink pillar's status lights halfway up their boot sequence froze. Then they reconfigured, shifting not in the order we knew but in some other pattern, an unfamiliar tempo. My drones started screaming in my feed. 6 separate intrusion alerts, overlapping, hit my HUD. uplink hub, ring maintenance, shaft heads, all at once. External cameras fed me fractured images, mining rigs unfolding from their dormant positions in the refineries, cutter heads rotating to expose coils and lenses, conveyor arms pivoting to bring heavy housings to bear on doors and corridors. The uplink was not just a communication pillar. It was a spinal node in a network we had never mapped. The first shot came from above. A thin beam of coherent energy lanced down from a concealed emitter in the ceiling and burned through one of my drones, then through the chest plate of the trooper behind it. His suit contained most of the vaporized metal and tissue, but the force still punched him off his feet and into the railing, where he folded and stayed. Everyone moved at once. Carbines came up. Fire poured into the ceiling recess where the beam originated. The metal glowed, warped, collapsed. But the shot had not needed a second firing. The point had been made. We were inside someone else's geometry. The locals had gone. The only trace they left was a pattern of open floor hatches and sealed maintenance doors. It would have gone worse if training had not been as deep as it was. The platoons split into fire cells, each taking a sector. Defensive positions formed at the hub's interior and exterior arcs. Drones tried to re-establish stable sensor corridors and died for it, winking out in pairs as invisible fields ate their electronics. The platoon leader realized the uplink was compromised in the same moment I did. You did not need a systems certification to see it. The pillar's status indicators were dancing to an alien beat. Alignment might still happen, but whatever signal rode that beam would not be ours alone. The order came down on the encrypted squad band. Terminate the uplink hardware. Fall back to secondary. We did not bother with charges. There was no time to rig them properly, and the pillar's external casing had been built to resist fragmentation. Instead, we bracketed it with concentrated rail fire, targeting access ports, coolant lines, armored seams. The air filled with metal dust and fragments as our shots hammered into the pillar, punching holes, shredding internal conduits. The lights faltered and died. Internal hums shifted to the grinding noise of machinery forced outside design parameters. Something in the depths of the moon did not like that. The next volley came from the ring's outer thickness. Self-propelled cutters devices that had once chewed slag and ore burst through sections of wall, their housings hastily armored and studded with directional charges. They skittered on monopod legs, clinging to surfaces, emitting sprays of sparks as they carved new lines of fire. Micro-drone swarms poured from their hatches, clouds of glittering fragments that tried to infiltrate suit seams and weapon ports. We cut them down. Railfire and suit-mounted flechette projectors turned drones into shifting clouds of shrapnel. Cutter units died in bursts of internal overpressure and fuel, but they took pieces of us with them. A trooper's leg disappeared from the knee down when a cutter's beam traced across the floor. Another lost an arm and most of their suit integrity in a localized explosion. We dragged the wounded behind partial cover. Automed systems dumped clot foam and anesthetic into open gashes. Some of them would live if we extracted within an hour. None of us believed we would. The uplink pillar sagged and went dark. The uplink mast above it, out in the vacuum, would be dead weight now. Our scheduled transmission was gone. That was the moment the war shifted shape in my head. Before that, it had been a mishandled survey. Poor data. Underestimated risks. After that, it was something else. A pattern resolved behind the events. The moon was not abandoned. It had never been. The maintenance caste did not simply keep the refineries alive for pay. They served. Not a corporation, not a distant fleet, but the system itself. A machine intelligence buried in the industrial fabric, one that had watched us arrive through cameras we did not know still functioned. We had not brought a forward depot to a dead world. We had walked a fleet into range of a dormant gun. We fell back along a route that felt like retreating through arteries. Corridors narrowed, then widened. then narrowed again, pinching us into kill zones. Bulkhead doors slammed down one by one behind us, forcing us to choose between speed and caution. In some segments, the lights went out entirely, leaving only our suit lamps cutting cones through suspended dust. The locals appeared at junctions, not to fight but to observe. They made fast signs to one another, sharp, economical flicks of the hands. Occasionally, one would reach for a control surface and the floor would tilt slightly, or a pressure differential would push at us like a slow hand. They did not need weapons. Their world was one. We lost 3 more troopers before we reached the ring's outer segment where the secondary uplink stub was supposed to be. It was gone. In its place, a jagged cavity opened onto vacuum, edges cored and melted by what my sensors tagged as a shaped demolition charge. Whoever had done it had known exactly where to place it to deny us that fallback without compromising the ring's structural integrity. That left the emergency ridge antenna. It had been mentioned only briefly in the initial brief, a line-of-sight relay stanchion out on one of the higher salt ridges beyond the refineries, maintained by the locals as a last resort channel for their own outgoing transmissions. It had never been part of our primary plan. The path to it was long and exposed, across plains pocked with slag pits and lit by occasional chemical glows where some old spill still outgassed. Under normal circumstances, no one would have suggested using it. Under these circumstances, it became the only path that led outward instead of inward. By the time we regrouped and cataloged casualties, we were down to 9 mobile troopers from an original 24. The platoon leader was among the dead. His helmet had become the blunt instrument of his death when a collapsing support strut turned his neck into a fulcrum. The chain of command settled on my shoulders with the dull weight of inevitability, not because I wanted it, but because of rank and proximity. The incoming task force's trajectory clock glowed at the edge of my HUD. Hours, not days. Not enough time to reconfigure anything on that scale, not without warning that would be trusted and authenticated. So we voted with our feet, the emergency antenna or nothing. We exited the ring through an auxiliary airlock whose inner door had to be forced open with suit-assisted leverage. Outside, the moon's surface spread all the way to the horizon, a cracked, uneven field of white salt glass with black slag islands jutting through. The refineries rose from it like fossilized towers, linked by skeletal conveyors and suspended pipes. The antenna ridge was a faint line on the horizon, marked on our maps as a series of contour increments and hazard overlays. The route to it ran between 2 refinery mesas across open ground where any cover would be coincidental. Our suits hardened their outer layers against radiation and chemical abrasion. External temperature dropped to numbers that meant nothing until they translated into projected energy loss curves. Our breath fogged the inside of our helmets for a moment before scrubbers took it, leaving only the noise of pump systems and blood in our ears. We spread out in a staggered line. No tight formation that would invite enfilade. Each trooper kept enough distance that a single beam or explosion would not disable more than one at a time. My rail carbine floated lightly in my hands. In low gravity, it felt like holding a toy until recoil reminded you otherwise. The first artillery pattern walked in 10 minutes later. Shells did not arc through a sky here. They came from low, from the bases of refineries where reconfigured mining charges spat directional bursts across the surface. Impact plumes punched up shards of salt glass and slag. Shrapnel rang against armor. One trooper went down when a jag of glass speared into the joint of their right hip actuator, locking the limb. They rolled, tried to stand, failed. We did not have the time or personnel to carry them and still make the ridge. They knew it before I had to decide. They released their magazine belts to the nearest trooper, slaved their suit's remaining power to internal life support, and stayed where they were, a low shape against the glare, trusting that the moon would take its time. The artillery learned. Our movement patterns became data points. Bursts began to land not just behind us but ahead, bracketing likely paths. We adjusted, zigzagging in 3 dimensions, using small rises in the salt surface as momentary shields. The slag pits were worse. They were the remains of earlier industrial burns, black voids in the white field, some crusted over, others open. Radiation spiked at their edges. Our suit's Geiger counters ticked up until software muted the sound, preserving our nerves. The machine presence used them as funnels, narrow, safe paths threaded between lethal pockets. We did not know which ones until a trooper's dosimeter screamed and their HUD flooded with warnings. Twice we had to backtrack tens of meters, wasting precious time and exposing ourselves to more fire. The sky remained black, indifferent. Fleet was somewhere above it, invisible. Our incoming ships were too far away to appear even as pinpricks. It felt as if we were walking under a lid. I lost track of time in the way I usually did when the only meaningful metric was distance. Steps, impacts, heartbeats, breaths. The ridge grew slowly, a low, sinuous rise breaking the plane of the horizon. The antenna mast on its crest was a thin, almost fragile line against the dark, braced by guy wires anchored in the salt. We were 5 when we reached the base of the ridge. Behind us, the refineries loomed, outlines softened by distance and shimmer. I could see movement on their upper levels, shapes crawling along walkways, glints of lenses tracking us. The artillery had not fired in several minutes. Either we had moved out of its optimal arcs, or something was holding it in reserve. Climbing the ridge was harder than walking the plain. The salt glass surface fractured under our boots, sliding away in thin, treacherous sheets. Low gravity made it easy to launch upward and dangerous to stop. My leg began its old complaint, a stiffness that turned each step into a calculation. Halfway up, the first of the machine's pursuing constructs reached the base. It had been a conveyor once. Now, it had been stripped down to a crawling spine festooned with cutter heads, grapples, and a forward-facing cluster of emitters. It moved with unsettling grace, using mechanical limbs to scale the lower slope. Behind it, others followed, a loose procession of repurposed machines, each customized for a specific function: line-of-sight beam projection, micro-drone launch, debris manipulation. We did not have the ammunition to stand on the ridge and trade fire at leisure. Every shot had to count. We rationed them, targeting critical joints, sensor clusters, power conduits. The constructs adapted, angling armored segments toward incoming rounds, using sacrificial limbs to shield their cores. We climbed and fired, inching toward the antenna mast. One trooper fell when a beam traced along the ridge and cut through the back of their suit. In vacuum, there is no scream, just a sudden plume of freezing vapor and a drop in heat signature. They convulsed once and went still. Their bodies slid a few meters down before catching on an outcrop, one arm extended as if pointing back to where we had come from. I did not look long. Those images root too easily. At the crest, the antenna mast rose from a reinforced base partly encased in salt. A small service platform ringed it, accessible by a short, steep incline. The mast itself was a thin lattice of metal, studded with dish elements and relay nodes. A small access panel sat at chest height on the base, its surface coated in frost. Up close, it looked absurdly fragile compared to what we had walked through to reach it. Suit diagnostics told me the mast still carried power. The locals had not cut this one. Maybe they had never expected us to reach it. Maybe it served their purposes too. The machine intelligence might have been confident enough to leave a potential mouth open, believing it could control whatever words passed through. I set 2 troopers on covering arcs, one facing down the ridge, one watching the flanks. The 5th trooper collapsed near the mast, too depleted to stand, their suit running on low reserves. They adjusted their position so they could still fire at anything that crested the ridge. My hands moved on automatic, popped the panel, patched suit comms into the mast's maintenance line, bypass authentication, forced the relay into manual override. Each step had been drilled into me. None of it had been expected to be used while under direct fire from reconfigured mining rigs on a death moon. Training is indifferent to context. Lines of text scrolled across my HUD as the mast's primitive systems negotiated with my suit's interface. I pushed past them, hammering through protocol trees, bypassing error messages, forcing a manual channel open. Somewhere above and outward, the mast's dishes reoriented in barely perceptible increments. Below, the machines reached the upper slope. Rail carbines cracked. The troopers on the ridge edge fired in short, precise bursts, conserving their last rounds. One construct lost its forward sensor cluster and tumbled back, crushing another. Microdrones swarmed in retaliation, a cloud of glittering motes that filled the air around us, pelting suits with impacts too small to matter individually, dangerous in aggregate if they found seams. My suit's filters shifted to emergency modes, slamming auxiliary shutters over intakes, redirecting airflow through tighter channels. Low warnings about heat buildup joined the chorus already filling my peripheral vision: hull integrity, radiation, ammunition, heart rate. The mast told me it was ready. A direct line of sight channel to the fleet's relay spine was open. Bandwidth limited, time window uncertain. Jamming fields from the machine core twisted the signal, forcing retransmissions. The longer I took to compose and send, the greater the chance that the path would close. There is no room for eloquence in a warning like that, just compressed facts. I sent everything that mattered: structural schematics annotated with discovered anomalies, sensor logs of uplink intrusion patterns, telemetry showing local machine activity, visual feeds of reconfigured rigs and guarding constructs, the coordinates and identification of the emergency mast. I attached a simple directive flag in the header: abort landing trajectories for all heavy carriers targeting the moon. I did not ask. I did not justify. Fleet Command would interpret or ignore as their processes dictated. My job was to make sure the data could not be dismissed as noise. The progress bar for transmission crawled. I felt the ridge under my boots vibrate. Machines climbed. Tractor arms dug into salt glass. A beam slashed across the mast, burning a line that missed the relay nodes by centimeters. My suit screamed about proximity damage, heat signatures flaring at my back. The bar completed. The mast flashed an acknowledgement. Signal received by relay spine, integrity degraded but acceptable. No guarantee the packet would make it further without mutilation. No promise of action, just a confirmation that somewhere beyond the dark lid of sky, something had hurt us. A strange quiet bloomed in me then, like a pocket of vacuum. I stepped away from the mast and turned to watch the horizon. The fleet's main carriers had been beyond unaided vision before. Now, my suit's systems flagged shifts in their trajectories. Tiny adjustments, almost symbolic at first. Then larger deviations as course corrections cascaded through formation. We had been a single-line item in a vast operational ledger. Now, the ledger was being rewritten around us. The machines seemed to notice. The constructs paused in their climb. Those with intact sensor heads turned upward, as if listening. Some pivoted back toward the refineries, retracting weapons. Others simply stopped, limbs splayed, systems idling. The artillery remained silent. I have no way of knowing if the machine core understood the full implications of that diversion. Whether it interpreted the change as a lost opportunity or a delayed advantage. It had not been destroyed. Its world still spun, its refineries still hummed. It had simply failed to add a fleet worth of hulls to its graveyard. The moment of reprieve did not extend to us. Suit diagnostics finally pushed past my conscious filters. My oxygen reserves were down to the last segment. Internal radiation dose had crossed the threshold where organ failure was a question of time, not probability. My leg's pain had become a steady, hot line from hip to ankle. When I shifted weight, my vision blurred at the edges. The troopers on the ridge edge were in similar shape. Their vitals flickered on my HUD, numbers edging toward red. One lost consciousness between one breath and the next, their weapons slipping from their grasp. They toppled sideways and rolled a meter before their suit caught on a protrusion. We could have tried to go back down, toward the ring, the refineries, the maintenance warrens. But there was nothing there for us except a more intimate form of death at the hands of constructs and collaborators. Out here, on the ridge, the moon would do the job slowly and impersonally. I sat with my back against the mast's base and let my carbine rest across my knees. The surface of the salt glass under me was cold enough that I felt it through the suit's insulation. The sky overhead was a simple, unbroken black. I thought about earlier campaigns then, as the numbers on my HUD slid downward. Operations where we had landed on worlds marked red from the start, where every step had been taken under known fire. How different it felt now, dying on a rock that someone had labeled safe until the last moment. I counted the faces of my squad in my head, matching them to the bile signs that had winked out over the past hours. The memory did not hurt the way it once had. It sat where everything else sat now, a list, a ledger, another line item. The mast vibrated behind me as it tracked some new alignment. The fleet would keep fighting elsewhere. The war would grind on, worlds measured in tonnage and throughput, lives in probability. The moon would remain, a white burn in the dark, with a buried machine thinking in its sleep. I wondered if anyone would ever come back here to finish the job. Cut the core out, shatter the refineries, clean the slate. It felt unlikely. There were always fresh fronts, fresh crises, fresher intel than what a dead staff sergeant had managed to send from a ridge. My suit's systems began to fail in layers. First, the external thermal sensors degraded, turning the world into a flat, gray field without gradients. Then, the peripheral indicators dimmed, leaving only a core display of vital signs and oxygen levels. Finally, even those shrank, as if receding into a tunnel. I knew I should initiate a final log. Standard procedure, record circumstances, probable causes, recommendations. But I had already done that in fragments, voicing observations into the suit's buffer while we moved, not trusting memory to hold them for later. This now was something else, not for archives, for order. So I spoke quietly, feeling the words more than hearing them through the suit's internal conduction. I laid out the sequence from orbit down to the ridge, step by step, as if debriefing a superior whose face I could no longer see. I kept my tone flat. No blame, no supplication, just facts. The act of recounting kept me present longer than my body wanted. Each remembered detail anchored me to a moment when the numbers on my HUD had been less terminal. Each described step was an extra heartbeat stolen from the end. By the time I finished, the troop vitals feed showed only one name: mine. I turned my head enough to see the plane below one last time. The shapes of the refineries were softer now, almost abstract. The constructs had withdrawn completely, disappearing into maintenance apertures and shaft mouths. The salt glass caught some distant starlight and reflected it in faint, broken lines. I blinked slowly. My eyes would not open as quickly as they closed. In the curved visor of the fallen trooper near the crest, I saw a tiny reflection still, a sliver of motion in the dark. The path of one of Fleet's carriers, adjusting onto a new vector, engines flaring just enough for my suit to catch and interpret. It would not burn here, not now. That was enough. My lungs dragged in one more thin breath of recycled air. My hands, emptied of the carbine at some unmarked point, rested on my thighs. The HUD dimmed to a few colored points, then to one, then to none. The moon remained what it had been before we came, a scar, a node in a war that would continue with or without us. I let myself sink into that fact, into the cold and the dark and the quiet. The end. That concludes tonight's tale. The engines throttled down to a soft, steady pulse. enough to hold you gently in place. Rest there as long as you need.